Good afternoon. Today we're going to discuss about non-verbal communication. In the last video, we talked about a fundamental type of communication which was verbal communication, and today we are going to talk about non-verbal communication. Any discussion on communication should ideally start with the notion that communication is a bipolar process. As I had discussed in the last video, bipolar means that there has to be a sender X who has the initial message for receiver Y, and on receiving the message, Y responds the manner in which X, the sender, wants him or her to respond. Now, in this paradigm of communication where there's an X and a Y, and the X has an initial message, X communicates his message in various manners. It is how X communicates his or her message to Y that by and large determines the type of communication. In verbal communication, we have seen that words are used. Words as in language. Language that is spoken across the world today. In non-verbal communication, X will not use words. Instead, would use, in non-verbal communication, X will use signs, symbols, gestures, actions, etc. These are the means by which X is going to communicate his message to Y. For example, a simple message that X is thirsty and wants a glass of water from Y. In words, X will say, may I have a glass of water? So the sentence using these words express X's need, that X is thirsty and X requires a glass of water from Y. Now, if X and Y do not understand a common language and X has no choice but use certain signs, certain symbols, certain gestures to explain this message, how will X do it? Simply, X may just draw a glass and indicate that X needs this glass of water, and Y will understand and give him this glass of water. Now here, what really matters is that X and Y, they must agree on the signs, symbols, gestures and actions. Which means that when we are communicating verbally, that is when we are communicating using a language with its words, the words and the language must be known, must be understood, and therefore must be common to both X and Y. Hence, once the language is known to X and Y, any word used by X will be meaningful to both X and Y. Similarly, if X is not able to use a language to communicate his need to Y for any number of reasons, like X and Y don't speak the same language, then X resorts to using signs, symbols, gestures, actions, so on and so forth. In that case, the commonality between the two would be the agreement. That is, both has to agree on the common sets of symbols. In our example, this image that X is making must be agreed upon by Y as well. That is, if X is drawing this and Y looks at it, Y should at once agree, yes, it is a glass of water. It is something, and then he responds. So this agreement is the fundamental in non-verbal communication. That is the first part of this very important type of communication. So what we realize is across communities, here what we would like to talk about is number one, communities. That is very local and very limited. That is the first affiliation of X. That means X and Y, or for that matter, any individual across the world would belong to a certain community. And this community will be a small community and limited to a small area. For instance, any ethnic community, say for instance the Punjabi community, the English community, the British community, the Bengali community, when we say South Indian, we're talking about the peninsular India. Of course, it has other micro communities. So initially we're talking about a community to which the communicators belong to. So the whole community must agree to the certain signs, and once this agreement is there, then the individuals belonging to that community will have no issues, no problems in communicating with signs, symbols, gestures and actions. Now today we are really not limited to a particular community. We transcend our community and we communicate with other communities in our country and gradually outside. This outside is globalization. In other words, when the world they kind of allow people or create situations when X and Y belong to different communities and they're interacting, it is natural that X and Y will not have common meaningful words. So X and Y will naturally resort to symbols, gestures and actions, and hence they are going beyond the local communities to which they belong, like X is a Bengali and Y could be a French. In that case, there has to be a universal agreement. So the second would be a universal agreement of signs, symbols and gestures. This universal agreement is globalization in non-verbal communication, and here we have contexts like the traffic signs, we have health symbols like hospitals, we have hospitality like hotels, dinings and so on and so forth, which has become a global repository of signs and which is understood by almost every community that is living in the world. Now coming down to X and Y, and we are looking at verbal communication and non-verbal communication. The question often arises, which is more superior? Is it verbal communication that is superior, or is it non-verbal communication which is more superior? If you really look at it, the answer is none is superior to other. What is important is situationally X as the sender of the message will sometimes have no choice, no option but to use verbal communication, and in other contexts X will have no choice, no option but to use non-verbal means to communicate his message to his receiver. And it is this situation, how X perceives it best, how X diagnoses the context and decides to use verbal, non-verbal or a mixture of both, which decides whether his communication is going to be good or not effective. So coming to this context, that there are situations when verbal communication has to resort to certain non-verbal means, we shall then talk about non-verbal elements in verbal communication. Right? So what are the non-verbal elements in verbal communication? This would mean that when X is speaking to Y, what happens? When X is speaking to Y and Y is listening, then Y not only listens but also looks at X. This is what happening to Y. X is speaking, Y is supposed to listen, but along with listening, Y also looks at X. And when Y looks at X, Y looks at the way X is dressing or his outfits, the makeup, that is the dress, the outfit, the makeup, the accessories that X is wearing, and the entire image that X presents to Y. So when Y is looking at X and Y is listening to X, there would be certain language is what Y is listening, plus you have certain factors like dress, accessories, makeup, gestures, and so forth. So say for instance, and here even this is what X is looking at, plus language is heard or X is listening to it. When you listen, apart from the language, X also listens to the tone, the pitch, and the voice. So you see, when verbal communication is happening and X is speaking to Y and X uses a language, Y listens, and when Y listens, he listens to the language as well as the tone, the pitch, and the voice X listens to. So here language is one component of listening, and tone, pitch, and voice are the other components of listening. But Y is also looking at X. So what is Y looking at? Y is looking at X's dress and outfit, X's accessories, X's makeup, and gestures. All this make up the non-verbal component of X's language while speaking to Y, even while asking a simple request like, may I have a glass of water? Thank you.